Hello, everyone. I'm Caroline Welsh, Director Emerita of the Adirondack Museum. I have spent a lot of time working on Adirondack Rustic, and I'm here today to share with you some of the things that I've learned. This lecture is entitled The Roots of Adirondack Rustic. Rusticity, to a large degree, was defined and refined in the Adirondacks. What is it? What is it not? What is Adirondack about it? Is it an aesthetic, an idea, an architectural style, a fashion for interior design, a type of furniture, a craft, an art, a business, a brand? Where did the stylistic vocabulary come from? A perusal of various dictionaries, including Webster's International Dictionary and the Oxford English Dictionary, reveals many definitions. Rustic is defined as plain and simple, unsophisticated, rough, sturdy, pertaining to or connected with the country or life in the country, of rude or country workmanship, specifically constructed of undressed branches of roots of undressed branches or roots of trees, characterized by a surface left rough-hewn, summer houses or furniture for summer houses, or for outdoor use made of rough limbs of trees. Rustic is also defined as a country man, awkward, rough, unpolished, as in rustic manners. Rusticity is defined as a lack of breeding, culture, or refinement. Rusticate is defined as to go into or reside in the country, pursue a rustic life. Rustication has for centuries been defined as a method to create textures on masonry surfaces and mortar joints to resemble rough stonework. An early 19th century British definition of rustic work states, decoration by means of rough woodwork, the bark being left in place, or by means of uncut stones, or by such combinations of these materials and devices as will cause the general appearance of what is thought rural in character. Nature and naturalness were defined similarly with relation to architecture. A house, quote, should not be made to count very strongly in the landscape and should tend to disappear in its natural background. Construction materials buttressed this organic relationship. They were selected because they were readily at hand on the land. Details comprising a rustic sensibility came from the natural world and vernacular traditions. Stylistic choices of log construction were deliberate, romantic choices for the rustic, the primitive or wild, and the natural, and were a reaction to the formality of classical architecture. In mid-18th century Britain, the wealthy, as they did 100 years later in America, fled the industrialized cities for the countryside and back to nature. Landscape architect Lancelot, known as Capability Brown, introduced informal and asymmetrical landscape plans for English country estates in the 1750s. By the 1790s, the popularity of naturalistic, picturesque grounds was paralleled by an equal enthusiasm for appropriately rustic cottages, quote, designed for such settings. Bark-covered porch posts are depicted in Edmund Vartel's Hints for Picturesque Improvements in Ornamental Cottages and Their Scenery, published in London in 1804. Rough stonework, thatch or tile roofs, and bark-clad posts continued to be incorporated in English designs throughout the century. In America, many ideas were adapted from the English landscape movement and incorporated in buildings, among them irregular silhouettes, earth colors, and rustic woodwork, often with the bark on. Alexander Jackson Davis and Andrew Jackson Downing originated the American Gothic style. Their widely published designs popularized cozy rustic cottages appropriate for naturalized rural settings and embodied the aesthetic principles derived from British rustic, informal, country dwellings and landscapes. By mid-century, such rustic architecture could be found in American city parks, seaside resorts, and country hotels. The American expression of rustic had at its core notions of wilderness as untamed and uninhabited nature, a concept of wilderness that was really an imaginative creation, since by the mid-19th century, much of America's wild land was tamed and lived in. Nevertheless, the idea spawned an extraordinary output of furniture, architecture, decorative arts, and art. The enduring fascination with rustic objects and sensibilities coincides with the enduring attraction of natural places and wilderness for Americans, and the importance of nature in American thought and culture. The Adirondack Camp, particularly what is now popularly known as the Great Camp, is in some ways the apotheosis of the log cabin. In the United States, by mid-19th century, the log cabin had become a national icon, embodying traits of fortitude, hardiness, democracy, and the pioneer spirit. 8 presidents, most notably Abraham Lincoln, had been born in log cabins, and after the 1876 Centennial Exposition, the log cabin began to appear in resort areas like the Adirondacks and Western National Parks. And this log cabin is the cabin that was at the Blue Mountain House, the current site of the Adirondack Museum, now known as the Adirondack Experience. A century ago, William Dix wrote in the periodical The Independent, "An Adirondack camp does not mean a canvas tent or a bark wigwam. It was a permanent home where the fortunate owners assemble for several weeks a year and live in perfect harmony, though in the heart of the woods. Deep in inaccessible forests, great camps were linked closely to the land and to Adirondack vernacular traditions of log and bark construction, as well as to architectural and aesthetic precedents. Great camps furthered an image consistent with prevailing romantic notions of wilderness. These complexes of buildings contrasted to the architecture of Adirondack villages, where houses and hotels conformed to the civilized, contemporary architectural styles of the Greek and Roman revivals, or the Second Empire, or Queen Anne. Great camp structures combined and transformed log construction methods originating in Europe, most specifically northern Italy, Switzerland, Germany, Scandinavia, the Baltics, and northern Russia. Native American influences and an aesthetic vocabulary derived from an 18th century English offshoot of Romanticism known as the picturesque. There were other contributors to the development of an Adirondack rustic aesthetic. 2 trends, the stick and the shingle style, emerged in the 1860s and 70s. The stick style, popularized by Richard Morris Hunt for informal resort and country dwellings, evolved from the Gothic Revival and was characterized by angularity, verticality, and asymmetry. The shingle style grew from the English Queen Anne, combining classical and medieval building forms and using contrasting materials and a unifying shingle covering over all surfaces. Shingle-style buildings relate to the British picturesque aesthetic because they look as though they grew out of the landscape and were indeed part of nature itself. The formal architectural vocabulary of the stick and shingle styles, porches, screens, natural materials, bays, and gables became elements of the Adirondack Great Camp aesthetic. The arts and crafts movement, whose heyday between 1890 and 1910 embodies the back to nature and truth to materials philosophy promulgated by John Ruskin and his circle. It was given physical form by William Morris in England and by Frank Lloyd Wright, Gustav Stickley, and others such as Rochester architect Harvey Ellis in America. The use of whole logs to create rustic summer houses or camps reflected the principles of simplicity, utility, and harmony with the land that were integral to the arts and crafts design philosophy. Quote, simplicity is the keynote of the design as it is in nature. The Adirondack Great Camp, a term that came into use in the 1970s to differentiate the large, more grand camps from the smaller ones, was a product of the Gilded Age. The term Gilded Age, coined by Mark Twain, writer and critic, and Charles Dudley Warner, described post-Civil War unbridled materialism. Burgeoning industrialization, massive new fortunes, and governmental corruption spawned a widespread retreat from civic responsibility. Older agrarian virtues were perceived to have been lost in the rise of cities and factories. The new elite retreated to the woods away from the world they had created in search of a more natural and healthful environment. They would never have used the term Great Camp to describe their camps in the woods. The archetypical Adirondack camp can be traced to the Durant family of Racket Lake. Dr. Thomas Clark Durant, entrepreneur and transcontinental railroad builder, came to Racket Lake in 1876, intent on developing the Adirondacks as a summer resort, an effort which he hoped would be facilitated by his Adirondack Railroad. Following local building styles, Dr. Durant's earliest lakeside dwellings were simple cabins constructed of bark-clad logs with prominent overhanging eaves. But it was Dr. Durant's son, William West Durant, who really formulated the Adirondack rustic architectural style. Well-educated and widely traveled, William Durant, while not schooled as an architect, had a passion for building. In 1877, he began the transformation of his father's place at Racket Lake. The result, Camp Pine Knot, reflected the confluence of many precedents: indigenous Adirondack log cabin construction, the Swiss chalet, the English picturesque style's use of naturalistic motifs, the stick and shingle styles, tenets of 18th century European and Japanese rusticity that placed buildings in wild and picturesque settings. In form, detail, and decoration, Camp Pine Knot can claim to be the progenitor of the Adirondack camp and model for Adirondack rustic architectural vocabulary. Camp Pine Knot's sheltering, overhanging eaves and many of the exterior wall surfaces were covered with bark. Coniferous spruce bark, surprisingly durable, became a characteristic material. Another hallmark was the decorative, open truss-like arrangement of logs inserted within the roof gable pediment. Japan opened to the West in 1854 by Admiral Perry and Samuel Francis DuPont, sent a pavilion to the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition in 1876. The decorative details, most particularly interlocking and geometric fretwork, were widely admired, especially by William West Durant. Another familiar feature of Adirondack camps was also derived from the Japanese, whose houses were linked pavilions set in the natural environment. Introduced by Durant, covered wooden boardwalks connected individual buildings, each of which had a separate function. Japanese architecture reflected a profound respect for nature and for the nature of materials. Durant gave these details rustic expression. The romantic, the exotic, and the architecture of local lumber camps and Swiss chalets were synthesized by Durant to create the Adirondack camp. Alfred Donaldson summarized Durant's contribution to architecture in his 1921 History of the Region. William West Durant had the happy inspiration to combine Adirondack features of the crude log cabin with the long, low lines of the graceful Swiss chalet. From this pleasing blend, there sprang a distinctive school of Adirondack architecture. Before it was built, there was nothing like it. Since then, despite infinite variations, there has been nothing essentially different from it. Durant began construction of Camp Cedars, among other great camps he designed and built, in 1880 for his cousin, Frederick Clark Durant, on a 30-acre tract at Forked Lake. In contrast to Pine Knot, Camp Cedars was actually built of logs, not sheathed with logs. The result was a rustic and rugged stockade-like structure, complete with towers. Logs were carefully matched for size and taper, unpeeled on the exterior, and notched at the corners. As the complex grew, freestanding buildings were grouped around courtyards, resembling Scandinavian and Japanese compounds. The interiors of Camp Cedars were finished with the same degree of care and precision as the exteriors. Furnishings were a mix of locally made rustic furniture, Japanese decorations, Native American blankets and rugs, Oriental rugs, animal heads and skins, snowshoes, pack baskets, skis, guns, and fishing rods. The assimilation of architectural and decorative ideas from contemporary styles and tastes, along with attention to comfort, contributed to the success and proliferation of the Adirondack rustic aesthetic. Rustic furniture stylistic antecedents, like architecture, are 18th century English and even earlier Chinese garden furniture. Designs for furniture made from trees began to appear in Europe in the 1740s. The first English pattern book for rustic furniture, a new book of Chinese designs, published in 1754, suggests the connection between the 18th century preoccupation with chinoiserie and the development of rustic taste. In China, the use of rustic furniture and designs in gardens and interiors was hundreds of years old by the 1750s. Additionally, in England, the new informal asymmetrical landscape plans for English country estates of the 1750s called for picturesque and naturalistic garden architecture and furniture. Logs and tree limbs were employed to build summer houses, gazebos, and pavilions, and the benches, seats, gates, and arbors to furnish or decorate them. As taste for rusticity accelerated, demand for rustic work grew. English shops and small factories proliferated to satisfy the need of Victorians to furnish their country or suburban homes and gardens. Rustic makers were largely anonymous. English contemporary writings comment that traditional carpenters, quote, were not next to useless because they were too used to, quote, square and rule. The best rustic craftsmen had a, quote, natural bent for the work and an eye, quote, for curious excrescences found on old trees and the natural bent branches. That same sentiment is true in the Adirondacks. Rustic furniture may be defined as furniture made from parts of trees, usually with little or no modification to those parts. In terms of materials, decorative ornamentation, structure, and form, Adirondack rustic furniture deserves serious study. As a type, rustic furniture was and is made elsewhere, particularly northern New England, the Appalachian states, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Rocky Mountain region, and California. and, in fact, any place where forests provide the building materials. Furniture made in these regions is often mislabeled Adirondack. This clearly suggests a belief that all rustic work and ideas originated in the Adirondacks and migrated to other parts of the country. In reality, there is no evidence that Adirondack rustic furniture had measurable influence on rustic work produced elsewhere. Adirondack rustic furniture marked a change in the way rustic furniture was made and looked in the 19th century. Before it, rustic furniture was generally crude and rough, meant only for a short life in the outdoors. Adirondack craftsmen, between the 1870s and the 1920s, introduced new levels of attention to detail and refinement of expression. They employed more of the tree in a greater variety of forms and techniques than either their predecessors or their modern successors. And it was in the Adirondacks that the furniture was incorporated into furnishings of great camps to heighten the overall rustic ambience. Tables and cabinets were clad with sheets of white birch bark or with elaborate and inventive geometric patterns of twigs or sticks. Beds and chairs were made of peeled or unpeeled spruce or cedar, or white or yellow birch with the bark still attached. Root, trunk, branch, twig, bark, pine cone, and leaf were all used singly or in combination to create and adorn this furniture. The best rustic furniture was one of a kind, and according to the few experts in the field, the best of that was made in the Adirondacks. Craig Gilborn, in Adirondack Furniture and the Rustic Tradition, maintains that mosaic twig work was the 19th century's primary contribution to rustic art, although its stylistic antecedents are definitely 18th century English. The Gardener's magazine in 1834 reports that surfaces of outdoor shelters were being decorated with, quote, wood mosaic, a treatment that was believed to be, quote, a rather modern invention. Split sticks of various lengths and sizes and having bark of different colors were nailed to flat surfaces in elaborate patterns. Examples produced by Adirondack rustic craftsmen number among the finest of this work. Elaborate and inventive combinations of geometric shapes abound. No two designs were exactly alike. Tables with polygonal tops and root bases are characteristic. The central Adirondacks, Racket Blue Mountain and Long Lakes, and their neighboring lakes, was the center of mosaic twig or pole work, both for furniture and architecture. A fine surviving example of mosaic pole work on a building is Sunset Cottage, formerly at Camp Cedars and now on the grounds of the Adirondack Museum, now known as the Adirondack Experience, which is sheathed on all four sides by split poles in elaborate geometric patterns. Rustic furniture is made by known and unknown builders. Pieces can be of extraordinary craftsmanship and beauty or crude and utilitarian objects. Rustic carpentry was often a collaboration between designer and builder. Alice Tillotson Boreem wrote a description of her Adirondack camp in The House Beautiful in 1901. Quote, "The rustic furniture was made by a builder guide. There is always a guide or builder who will make them after your description." Seth Pierce built several magnificent mosaic twig pieces for wealthy camp owners, including this elaborate mosaic corner cupboard made of twigs from 10 different tree species and mimicking the flower basket quilt design. He typified the rustic builder when he wrote, quote, "My occupation is guiding, fishing, and hunting, and once in a while I take my tools and go at carpenter work." Next to the region's signature guideboat, rustic furniture was the most important contribution made by native Adirondackers to regional crafts. Making rustic furniture and guide boats was a part-time occupation for men who also worked as guides, carpenters, loggers, farmers, and caretakers during the years 1880 to 1910. A rustic icebox or cellarette, designed by New York City architect Augustus Shepard, built of unpeeled spruce poles and decorated by unpeeled spruce rods in a mosaic pattern for a camp at the Adirondack League Club, embodies the marriage of elegant living and high-style forms with rustic construction. The design for the cellarette was published in Shepard's Camps in the Woods in 1931 by Architectural Book Publishing Company. The yellow birch furniture with white birch veneer and applied yellow birch decorations made by Upper Saranac Lake's Ernest Stowe for Camp Nenomas and its owner Isaac Simonin of Philadelphia is also high-style furniture. Several important examples include a dining table and chairs, a mirror, a secretary desk, and sideboard survive in the collections of the Adirondack Museum, now known as the Adirondack Experience. The configurations and elegance of finish rely more on traditional furniture forms and cultural preferences for the picturesque than on rough constructions made of found materials. The same is true of the beds, grandfather clocks, desks, sideboards, and dressers made by Joseph O.A. Briere for Camps Osceola and Stott and for his hotel Brightside on Racket Lake. Seneca Ray Stoddard, noted photographer and guideboat writer, stated in 1897, quote, Mr. Briere is noted for artistic skill in the manufacture of rustic furniture. His services in this particular line are at a premium in the woods, and many camps hereabout show beautiful specimens of his skill. By the late 19th century, the Adirondack rustic aesthetic was incorporated in national mainstream architecture for vacation homes across the country, particularly in the Appalachians, Maine, the Great Lakes states, Canada, and the Rocky Mountains. Log building plans modeled after Adirondack camps were published in how-to books. In 1890, Forest and Stream Publishing Company published Log Cabins, How to Build and Furnish Them by William S. Wicks. As early as 1916, the National Park Service adapted the style for its lodges and camps. The Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s built Adirondack-style lean-tos and other rustic structures in the forest and mountain regions across the country. As Alfred Donaldson remarked, the remarkably rich and diverse rustic style still appeals today. As Alfred Donaldson noted in 1921, quote, camp in Adirondack parlance has become a loose term applied indiscriminately to anything from a tent to a palace erected in the woods. A renaissance can also be seen in contemporary rustic furniture productions. Artisans and craftsmen abound in the Adirondacks, the Southeast, Upper Midwest, and Far West. Their imaginative and often fanciful creations carry on a long tradition. The Adirondack Museum's popular Rustic Fair in September hosts some of the region's finest craftsmen and examples of their work. View is hosting a select rustic show to showcase several contemporary artists and furniture makers who are emblematic of those who continue to make creative and often ingenious contributions to the rustic aesthetic. Thank you.